My new book is out now, and it's called Alien, Scene by Scene. And it's the fourth of my scene-by-scene books. I've done Apocalypse Now and Star Wars and The Shining now, and this is the fourth of them. It may be the last. I'm not sure whether I will continue the series or not. But at this point, the series as it stands is a tetralogy of four of what I think are the greatest films ever made. And Alien is really one of the greatest. And there's a lot of rich semiotics going on in this film. Now, what I've done is to invent the concept of what I call the metaphysical vulva, which is a concept that I've introduced in opposition to the Lacanian phallus. For Lacan, now, the phallus is something that exists on three different registers, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The real phallus is simply the biological organ of the penis, whereas the imaginary phallus is a kind of fantasy object that exists in the infant's mind when the mother is off elsewhere. The mother is off elsewhere, and the infant, the pre-castrated infant, hypothesizes this imaginary phallus as the object that she is going to seek, and tries to become that phallus. But he can't, because the father has the real phallus, and he has to accede to the name of the father. Castration occurs when the child shifts from the imaginary plane to the symbolic, which is associated with the name of the father and the paternal metaphor and the paternal authority. And so he has to the child or infant has to let go of being the phallus. And the imaginary phallus disintegrates and dissolves, and then there's the symbolic phallus, which has to do with, on the symbolic plane, after a successful castration has occurred, the symbolic phallus really personifies the desire for the other for both sexes. The woman does not have the phallus. Instead, in her psyche, she has a semiotic vacancy where a phallus is not, and because it is not, there's a certain way in which it is there for Lacan. And so the phallus on the symbolic plane simply becomes the symbol for the jouissance that the sexes experience with each other. Now, for Lacan, as I mentioned in my book on Apocalypse Now, Scene by Scene, for Lacan, the phallus really is, or not the phallus, but the father is the real supremely spiritual authority. He's following in Freud's patriarchal footsteps here. Now, as everyone knows, the conflict between Freud and Jung was precisely over the issue of Freud's patriarchy and Jung's matriarchy. Jung had read his Bachofen. J.J. Bachofen was a jurist in the 19th century who in 1861 put out the book called Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, in which he figured out that there was an earlier, an older epoch behind the gods of the Olympian pantheon in which the mother ruled, and children took their mother's names. And he found various examples amongst Greek places, amongst the Lydians, let's say, or the Egyptians, in which the name of the mother was passed along matrilineally. And he realized that that must have referred to an earlier time when children took their mother's names. And so he hypothesized this matrilineal epoch. Bachofen basically divided history up into three distinct stages. The earliest is the Aphroditic heteric stage of primal promiscuity, in which everyone is promiscuous. Marriage does not exist. And so nobody knows who's related to who. Nobody knows which children have come from who. Although I think Bachofen has failed, I don't think that really represents what the state of things would have been in, let's say, the Paleolithic. I think that bloodlines would have been carefully tracked, as they are in clans and kinship societies, and resemblances of the children to the parents would also have been noticed. I think they would have known darn well who the fathers were. But let's say, hypothetically, we have an Aphroditic heteric epoch that degenerates because of abuses by the men against the women, and so the Amazons form in reaction to this. So the Amazons reject marriage, and they reject, which according to Bachofen hasn't come into existence yet, and they reject the male, basically. And it represents a sort of degeneration, but it also represents the beginnings of the shift into the Demetrian matriarchal mode. The matriarchal mode proper comes into being with the rise of agriculture. Demeter is the goddess of the soil, and the institution of marriage comes in, and Mother Right rules. And we do have vestigial echoes of this epoch in texts like Hesiod's Theogony, which is full of what are known as parthenogenetic births. Parthenos means virgin, and a parthenogenetic birth is when the goddess gives birth without insemination by a male, which is right on the first couple of pages after the invocation to the Muses in the Theogony, in which Chaos simply gives birth to Gaia. Gaia gives birth spontaneously to Eros and Tartarus. They just spring forth from out of her. That's a parthenogenetic birth, and we can find examples of that all over the world, and I think it's analogized to the fact that it seems as though the earth parthenogenetically just sprouts up. It gives birth to these plants. Ancient man knew just as well as we do that you have to plant the seed first in order to get the plant to come out. But it's a little bit like the fact that, you know, we see the sun rise every day, and we know scientifically now that it doesn't rise. The earth is revolving, but we still experience it as rising. It looks like it's rising. And so I think that the soil, the power of Gaia, the earth mother herself, to give birth to vegetation seems as though it was parthenogenetic, and it was constantly, spontaneously giving forth life. And so we get the myth of the vulva on the imaginary plane. Now, the metaphysical vulva, I think, exists on the same three registers as the Lacanian phallus. The real vulva would simply be this or that particular vagina. But the imaginary vulva is the mythical vulva that exists, that comes into existence, possibly as early as the Paleolithic, but definitely by the time of Bakophen's matrilineal age, the age of Mother Right, in which we get all of these parthenogenetic births, in which the goddess retains the power to give birth spontaneously. Now, this gets appropriated from her during the metaphysical age that comes in with the Greeks and the Jews, the rise of the metaphysical age, and the metaphysical vulva then is appropriated and transformed into a symbolic vulva on the symbolic register. In these kinds of myths where we see the father taking over the female power to give life, Adam gives birth to Eve from out of his side as though he had a vagina. Zeus gives birth to Dionysus after Semele is destroyed by his lightning flash. The fetus survives, he has it sewn into his thigh, and he gives birth to it as though he were a woman. He also gives birth to Athena from out of his head. In one version, in Hesiod's Theogony, he does this spontaneously. Athena, the goddess of rationality, simply is born from out of his head. And then Hesiod interestingly points out that Hera gives birth parthenogenetically to Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, in response. They each sort of create their own countersexual gods there. In other versions of the myth, Hephaestus is the one who creates the axe that is used to chop Zeus's head open to release Athena from his head. But in either case, this is the metaphysical vulva as it is appropriated in the metaphysical age on the symbolic level by the father, where it now becomes the symbol. It's interiorized into the male psyche. It becomes the male womb, and it becomes associated with the power of the muses. It becomes associated with the power to give birth to ideas. And that is the metaphysical vulva as appropriated during that age. Now, in the late period, as we move into the birth of science and the scientific industrial revolution gets going, the power of father science to give birth parthenogenetically begins to become more and more evident. I think Mary Shelley was already well aware of this when she wrote Frankenstein as the modern Prometheus in 1818. She already foresaw this. The power of big corporations and laboratory science to appropriate the metaphysical vulva through things like genetic engineering, in vitro fertilization, cloning, the creation of the sheep dolly and all the other clones that have been created since, most of them that come out sickly, and there's always something wrong with them. But it is the attempt of father science to deterritorialize the metaphysical vulva from the earth and to appropriate. Father science wants to appropriate the power to create forms. This is what's going on in Alien. You can find that there are two sign regimes in Alien. Now, the concept of the sign regime was an invention of Deleuze and Guattari that comes from their book A Thousand Plateaus. They discuss 5 different sign regimes, and a sign regime is simply a cluster of semiotics. It's a cluster of signifiers with semiotics. No sign regime is pure, they say. They always come mixed and hybridized because there's always one laid on top of another like strata. But in Alien, I think we can designate sign regime A, let's say, as the ship of the Nostromo itself, in which the scientific industrial complex of the big corporations, significantly named Weyland-Yutani. Weyland is, of course, Wieland the Smith. who's the equivalent to Hephaestus, the blacksmith character, in which they have they've appropriated the powers of Gaia to create a completely artificial environment, what Peter Sloterdijk calls an absolute world island. An absolute world island is an artificial environment that has been thrust out into conditions that are 100% hostile to human existence. If anything goes wrong on such a world island, as it did when the O-rings froze with the launch of the Challenger in 1986, that world island can disintegrate. They're very fragile. But here we find, as the movie opens up, that there's artificial gravity. There's a computer central nervous system named Mother, significantly, that runs the ship. It's really father science, coding itself as an artificial mother, who takes care of this crew of 7, and they wake up like embryos out of their sleeping pods right at the start of the film. So everything is synthetic. Everything has been artificialized. Everything has been appropriated by the big corporation, who now wants to take the metaphysical vulva over completely and sends the crew to this planet to get this organism. Now, the planet, when they encounter it, is part of what I term the Giegerian sign regime, that of H.R. Giger's designs of the aliens and the monsters. When they go to the planet and they discover this ship that from one point of view looks like a woman with her legs spread open, and she's got 3 vulvas as they go into the entrance, and all they find in there is eggs and a dead space giant, and the eggs have living forms in them that attack and infect Sign Regime A. When they bring it back on board the ship, Sign Regime B begins to re-territorialize and overcode Sign Regime A and begin to dismantle it. With its rapid biomorphic power of transformation, the alien has the metaphysical vulva. It is the metaphysical vulva with its power of rapid transformation. Keep in mind that, in a way, when the serpent bursts forth from Cain's chest, it does not inseminate him because he has no eggs to inseminate. It re-territorializes his mouth as a vagina and re-territorializes his stomach as a uterus, and simply inserts a tube down in there that plants a tiny embryo in there. So the embryo is already in there, and it's micro-sized, and it just gets larger and larger and larger, exactly like an in vitro fertilization. And when Cain gives birth to the chestburster, Ash later refers to it as Cain's son. It's basically the myth of the appropriation of the metaphysical vulva, just as Zeus gives birth to Athena from out of his head, only it's shifted down. The difference is, though, that what he's giving birth to is a naga, what the Hindus call a naga, a serpent with the biomorphic power to rapidly change, shed its skin, and metamorphose. And the crew can't keep up with it. They're all eliminated one by one, and the ship ends by being destroyed. Sign Regime B completely disrupts and overcodes Sign Regime A and destroys it. And Ripley becomes recoded. She shifts from Sign Regime A as a warrant officer to, in the process of battling with the alien Sign Regime B, as an Amazonian warrior. She's one of the first great dragon slayers in cinema, and she's recoded into Sign Regime B. In a way, I think the two, like Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the two sign regimes are fusing together in order to form a third sign regime, a sign regime C, which is beginning to form out of all this. So that's what's going on in my book, Alien Scene by Scene, and I hope you'll buy it and enjoy it. It's available for purchase right now on Amazon. Thank you.